Welcome back to another deep dive into one of horror's most mysterious and haunting universes. Tonight, we're exploring the complete chronological history of Silent Hill. Find your most comfortable position and allow yourself to drift as we journey through decades of mystery, tragedy, and the supernatural forces that bind them together. This will take us deep into the night, through layers of history and manifestation, into the very essence of what Silent Hill represents and what it has become across the centuries. Silent Hill is not simply a town, it's a nexus, a location where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds have worn thin, where human guilt manifests as environmental reality, and where the past refuses to remain buried. Understanding Silent Hill requires us to go back much further than most people realize. We must begin with the land itself, long before any European settlers arrived, long before any roads were built or buildings constructed. We must go back to when the region was pristine wilderness, inhabited by indigenous peoples who understood something about this place that modern civilization has largely forgotten. We must go back to a time when the only sounds were natural sounds, the wind through ancient forests, the call of birds, the flow of streams and rivers, and when a certain awareness existed in the land itself, a consciousness that watched and remembered everything. The Native American tribes who inhabited the land that would become Silent Hill possessed a deep and profound understanding of the spiritual forces that dwelled there. They conducted elaborate ceremonies and rituals to maintain harmony between the living world and the unseen realm. These ceremonies were not perfunctory or merely traditional. They were active practices of spiritual maintenance, ways of keeping the membrane between worlds in balance. The mist that perpetually clings to Silent Hill's valleys was not seen as something to fear or avoid, but rather as a sacred veil, a thin membrane separating the physical from the spiritual. The tribes left markers throughout the region, carved into ancient stones and trees, warnings to outsiders about disturbing the delicate balance that had been maintained for countless generations. These markings were both warnings and prayers, both protective spells and desperate communications to future generations about what this place was and what needed to be protected. These weren't merely superstitions or folklore, though outsiders would later dismiss them as such. They were practical knowledge accumulated through centuries of observation and interaction with the land's unique properties. The indigenous peoples understood something fundamental about this region that modern science has been unable to fully articulate. That certain places on Earth possess particular qualities, that consciousness and geography are intimately connected, that some locations naturally amplify psychic phenomena and spiritual manifestations. They understood that disturbance of such places could trigger cascading consequences that would persist for generations. The ceremonies conducted by the tribes were designed to honor and appease the forces that dwelled in this region. Offerings were made to ancestors and to the spirits of the land. Sacred sites were maintained and protected. Rituals were performed at particular times and seasons to maintain the balance that had been established over countless generations. The entire system was designed to work in cooperation with the land's inherent nature rather than against it. It was an approach based on respect, reciprocity, and a deep understanding of humanity's place within a larger spiritual and natural order. As European settlers began arriving in significant numbers during the 1800s, something shifted fundamentally. The newcomers didn't understand the warnings, they didn't respect the markers or comprehend the spiritual significance of the land. To them, Silent Hill was simply another frontier to be claimed, resources to be extracted, space to be conquered and developed according to their vision and needs. The sacred sites that the indigenous peoples had carefully protected became obstacles to development, or were simply destroyed to clear land for building. The ceremonies and rituals that had maintained the spiritual balance for centuries were interrupted and forgotten, as settlers pushed the indigenous population from their ancestral territories. Violence erupted. There were skirmishes and conflicts as tribes fought to protect their sacred sites and their way of life. In these confrontations, blood was spilled, not just any blood, but blood shed on ground that was already spiritually charged, already infused with generations of careful spiritual maintenance. According to historical accounts and local folklore, one particularly brutal conflict occurred when Native Americans attempted to defend a sacred site from armed settlers determined to claim the land for themselves. The battle was fierce but ultimately futile. As the tribal defenders fell, something shifted in the land itself. Witnesses reported strange phenomena in the years that followed these violent confrontations. They spoke of whispers carried on the wind that couldn't be explained through any natural mechanism. They reported seeing shadowy figures appearing in the mist, only to vanish when approached. An overwhelming sense of wrongness settled over the region, a feeling that the land had become aware of the violence committed against it and had begun to respond. The settlers who survived these encounters reported feeling watched, judged, as if the land itself had become a conscious entity observing their actions and preparing some form of response or retribution. What happened next was gradual and subtle, unfolding over years and decades rather than in any dramatic single event. The fog that had always clung to the valleys began to behave strangely. It would roll in at odd times, obscuring familiar paths and turning daytime into perpetual twilight. People reported vivid, unsettling dreams, nightmares so vivid and personal, they felt like memories of things they had never experienced. These dreams seemed to reflect each person's deepest fears and guilts, their secret shames and hidden regrets. Some settlers interpreted this as divine punishment. Others dismissed it as superstition and stress. But regardless of interpretation, an unspoken dread began to settle over the region. The early town that began to develop around Silent Hill attracted a certain type of person. Those seeking isolation, those running from their pasts, those hoping that a fresh start in a remote frontier town might erase their sins. There was something about the place that drew people who carried heavy psychological burdens. It was as if the land itself was calling to those with unresolved guilt and trauma, drawing them into proximity with forces that would mirror and magnify their internal struggles. Among the earliest documented residents was a man named Jebediah Foster, who arrived in 1867 with his pregnant wife Esther. Foster had a dark reputation that preceded him. He was known as the Hellrider, a man whose past was stained with violence, blood, and moral compromise. He had been involved in land disputes that turned brutal. Indigenous people had died at his hands. He had been party to atrocities committed during the expansion westward, actions that he carried with him like invisible chains. He had used other human beings as shields in violent confrontations. He had pursued his ambitions with a ruthlessness that had cost others their lives. By all accounts, Foster wanted to escape that life. He wanted to believe that moving to a remote frontier town might allow him to become a different person, to shed his violent past like an old skin and begin again with a clean slate. He brought his wife Esther to an isolated homestead in the region, seeking the peace and anonymity that such a remote location might offer. For a brief moment, it seemed as though escape might be possible, but Silent Hill, it seemed, had other plans. From the moment Foster arrived, strange things began happening around him. He encountered apparitions in the darkness, skeletal forms that seemed to watch him with malevolent awareness, as if the very spirits of those he had wronged were following him to this isolated place. These manifestations were not vague or ambiguous, they were specific, showing him faces he recognized, people he had killed, whose blood he had shed. His wife Esther experienced illness and distress during her pregnancy, supernatural phenomena that seemed designed to terrorize her and drive wedges between her and her husband. There were nightmares, unexplained sounds in the night, an overwhelming sense of malevolence that seemed to emanate from the land itself. Foster attempted to report these occurrences to the authorities, to seek help and explanation from the town's law enforcement. But the town's law enforcement seemed disinterested or perhaps terrified of what investigating such phenomena might reveal. There was a sense that what was happening to Foster was not considered unusual in the context of this place, that Others had experienced similar phenomena, and that attempting to fight against it was ultimately futile. As Esther's labor began, things escalated dramatically and horrifically. A local woman named Enola appeared, an elderly Native American whose hands were literally stained with blood. She entered the foster home uninvited, her presence seeming to darken the very atmosphere around her. She spoke directly to Foster about his crimes, listing specific atrocities, murders committed during territorial disputes, a woman named Awanita, who had been killed in a raid along with her unborn child. Enola's words were not accusations from a stranger, but rather indictments from the voice of the land itself, speaking through her. Enola spoke of justice and retribution, of spirits that would demand payment for the lives taken, of a cycle of retribution that Silent Hill itself would enforce. Her presence seemed to act as a catalyst, accelerating the manifestations and the supernatural phenomena that had been building since Foster's arrival. As Esther struggled through her labor, the town itself seemed to burn. Fires broke out at key locations: the sheriff's office, local taverns, places significant to Foster's history in the region, spreading as if driven by forces beyond natural explanation. The fires were accompanied by apparitions of those Foster had killed rising up to confront him. Men he had murdered in conflicts, women whose lives he had destroyed, all manifesting from the supernatural forces that the land was channeling. Foster was forced to fight his way through these manifestations, reliving his violent past as he attempted to reach his wife. Each encounter with a ghostly victim seemed to drain him further, forcing him to confront the weight of his actions in visceral and undeniable ways. When the Foster family's house erupted in flames, both Jebediah and Esther perished in the inferno. Their bodies were found in the wreckage, burned beyond easy recognition. The newborn child disappeared, claimed by Enola, who declared that the spirits had reclaimed what was owed to them through the birth of a new being who would serve their purposes. A local named Howard Blackwood, who witnessed the chaos, reported that Enola spoke calmly about the fires as if they were a natural consequence of unbalanced justice, as if the land's response was not unusual, but rather expected and appropriate. She seemed to suggest that this was merely the beginning, that Silent Hill was awakening to its role as a nexus for spiritual retribution, that the dormant forces in the land had been stirred by decades of violence and violation and were beginning to actively enforce a cosmic accounting system where debts of blood would be paid and injustices would be balanced. The Foster incident established a pattern that would repeat itself throughout Silent Hill's history. The town seemed to operate according to principles that transcended normal logic. It was as if the location had become conscious, aware of the guilt and moral compromise of those within its borders. Decades passed. Silent Hill developed slowly, attracting a steady stream of residents who came for various reasons: isolation, escape, fresh starts, business opportunities. A town infrastructure developed. Buildings were constructed, roads were laid out, schools and hospitals and administrative buildings were established. To casual observers, Silent Hill appeared to be developing along lines similar to any other small American town. Yet rumors about the town's supernatural nature persisted in local folklore, whispered in bars and around dinner tables. These rumors were dismissed by most as rural superstition, the kinds of stories that accumulated in isolated communities. However, those who spent significant time in Silent Hill often reported similar experiences: vivid, emotionally intense nightmares that seemed to reflect their personal secrets, encounters with strange phenomena that couldn't be explained through conventional means, an overwhelming sense of being observed and judged by something vast and impersonal. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, Silent Hill had attracted the attention of certain groups and organizations. The Order, a secret society with deep theological and mystical commitments, identified Silent Hill as a location of particular spiritual significance. The Order had centuries of accumulated knowledge about sites around the world where the boundary between the physical and spiritual became particularly thin. They had carefully studied the phenomena reported in Silent Hill and concluded that the location possessed unique potential. The order's theology held that it was possible to birth divine entities into the world through particular combinations of ritual, sacrifice, and spiritual focus. They believed that locations like Silent Hill, already infused with spiritual power and sensitive to human consciousness, could serve as nexuses for such manifestations. The goal of the order was no less than the birth of a god into the world, a deity that would usher in a new age of spiritual transcendence and transform human existence fundamentally. To pursue this goal, the order began establishing institutions within Silent Hill. They established the Wish House Orphanage, ostensibly a facility designed to care for abandoned and orphaned children. In reality, it became a front for indoctrination into the order's theology and practice. Children were systematically manipulated and psychologically shaped to make them useful to the order's purposes. They were taught that their pain and suffering was meaningful, that their personal trauma was necessary for a greater spiritual purpose. Through a combination of isolation, psychological manipulation, and carefully orchestrated spiritual experiences, the children were transformed into individuals capable of serving the order's agenda. Similarly, Cedar Grove Sanitarium was established as a facility for the treatment of mental illness and psychological disturbance. In reality, it became another experimental site where vulnerable individuals, those with mental illness, those struggling with addiction, those carrying significant trauma, were subjected to psychological experiments designed to amplify their suffering and render them more susceptible to supernatural phenomena. The sanitarium staff, working under the order's direction, administered experimental drugs and subjected patients to conditions that would induce psychological breaks and hallucinations. The goal was to create individuals whose psychological fragmentation would make them useful as potential vessels or for other purposes within the order's grand design. Throughout the pre-1980s period, the order was quietly but systematically consolidating power within Silent Hill. They established networks of influence that extended into the town's government, law enforcement, and institutions. Founding families made pacts with the order, agreeing to participate in ritualistic sacrifices in exchange for promises of spiritual protection and eventual transcendence. Children were identified and selected for particular roles within the spiritual hierarchy based on their psychic sensitivity and psychological vulnerability. The God seed, as it was called in the order's theology, was being prepared, dimanche, nurtured through a complex system of rituals and sacrifices designed to eventually manifest as a physical entity born from a human host. In 1918, another significant event occurred that would add another layer to Silent Hill's dark history. A boat called the Little Baroness was traveling across Toluca Lake, one of the major bodies of water near Silent Hill. On this boat was a woman named Lorraine, traveling with her young daughter Hanna. By all accounts, Lorraine was experiencing severe emotional distress that had perhaps been exacerbated by proximity to Silent Hill's psychological influence. Whether through genuine mental illness or through the effects of the land's subtle influence on her consciousness, Lorraine's psychological stability deteriorated catastrophically during the voyage. In a moment of overwhelming despair that transcended normal parental instinct, Lorraine lifted her daughter and cast her into the lake's dark waters. Hanna disappeared beneath the surface, drowned by her own mother, in an act of violence born from complete psychological breakdown. The child's final moments were spent struggling in dark water, experiencing terror and confusion as she sank beneath the surface. The trauma of that death, the concentrated anguish of a child's final moments, left an imprint on the location that would persist for generations. The crew of the Little Baroness reported that something changed the moment Hanna entered the water. The atmosphere shifted, the weather turned violent. The boat, which had been stable and secure, began to list and rock in increasingly severe ways. Within hours, the boat had sunk, taking most of its passengers down with it. Survivors spoke of unnatural phenomena, whispers rising from the depths, shadows moving beneath the surface with apparent intention, as if the water itself had become aware and angry. In the years that followed, fishermen began avoiding certain areas of Toluca Lake. Local legends spoke of a child's cries heard on foggy nights, of spectral forms visible just beneath the water's surface, of a curse tied to Hannah's tragic death. The lake began to function as another repository of Silent Hill's spiritual accumulation. Places where particular tragedies had occurred seemed to become especially charged with supernatural energy. The land wasn't just passively reflecting human guilt. It was actively collecting it, storing it, creating zones of heightened supernatural activity. Toluca Lake became one such zone. Those who ventured near it often reported disturbing experiences, visions of drowning, overwhelming sensations of despair and loss that seemed to come from outside themselves. Silent Hill's influence, however, was not confined to the town itself or even to the immediate region. A Japanese village in the 1960s, isolated in its own way by geography and tradition, became affected by similar phenomena. A young girl named Hinako Shimizu lived in this village with her family. Her home life was marked by tension and abuse. Her father was volatile and emotionally damaging, prone to angry outbursts that left psychological scars. Her older sister Yunko had escaped, leaving to marry and begin a life away from the family dysfunction. Hinako found herself trapped in the family situation there without the escape that Yunko had managed to achieve. Despite the family dysfunction, Hinako found solace in friendships with local children. Sakuko, a girl who dreamed of opening a sweet shop. Shu, a boy whose kindness and thoughtfulness offered emotional support. And Ringo, a more contentious acquaintance whose jealousy and insecurity complicated their interactions. These friendships provided a counterbalance to her home's chaos, moments of genuine connection and normalcy amid the perpetual tension of her family situation. Shu was particularly important to her, offering support through simple gestures, like giving her painkillers to ease the persistent headaches that had begun plaguing her. Hinako began experiencing severe headaches that seemed to have no physical cause. She felt disconnected from reality at times, as if she were perceiving things that existed just beyond the normal spectrum of awareness. The headaches intensified over time, coming in waves that would leave her disoriented and confused. As the headaches became more severe, she found herself slipping into altered states, dreamlike realms where the village became distorted and surreal, where the boundaries between waking and dreaming became permeable and confusing. In these visions, she encountered a figure known as the Kitsune, a man in a white suit wearing a fox mask. This figure seemed to offer guidance and protection, leading her through spiritual trials and puzzles that promised purification and peace. The Kitsune would speak to her in a calm, measured way about the nature of her suffering and the path toward transcendence. He would offer her protection from the manifestations that were beginning to emerge, shelter from the supernatural forces that were intensifying around her. Yet cryptic warnings appeared in the form of small dolls, with messages suggesting she shouldn't trust this figure. These dolls would appear in her path, left as if by an unseen hand, each bearing a different warning. Don't trust the Foxman. Run. Beware. The warnings created a profound internal conflict. The Kitsune offered safety and guidance, but the dolls suggested that this apparent safety was a trap, that the Foxman's intentions were not benevolent, but rather manipulative. The village's ancient shrines and forgotten rituals began to manifest in disturbing ways. The natural mist that rolled through the area became thick and unnatural, moving with apparent intention. Monsters emerged from the darkness, their forms grotesque combinations of plant matter and shadow. These creatures seemed to embody the corrupted nature of the land's spiritual forces, manifestations of the imbalance that was accumulating in the region. Sakuko was consumed by one such creature, her body overtaken by blooming floral growth that seemed to possess its own horrible vitality. She became a grotesque hybrid of human and plant, her body serving as a substrate for the growth of flowers and vines. Her transformation seemed to embody the land's hunger, its appetite for consuming and incorporating human flesh into its supernatural manifestations. The sight of Sakuko's transformed state traumatized Hinako deeply, forcing her to acknowledge that the supernatural forces she was encountering were genuinely dangerous and genuinely beyond her control. As the manifestations intensified, Hinako was forced through a series of increasingly disturbing trials. The kitsune figure guided her to perform rituals that involved personal sacrifice. She had to solve puzzles involving the arrangement of symbolic items. She had to make choices that seemed to have moral weight, decisions about which friends to save and which to condemn. The trials progressed in intensity and in the degree of personal cost they demanded from her. Eventually, the rituals progressed to direct physical harm. The kitsune guided her to perform ceremonies that involved self-mutilation and pain. In one ritual, her arm was severed through a combination of spiritual force and psychological compulsion. The pain was real and overwhelming, leaving her with a permanent physical mutilation. In another ritual, her skin was branded with a heated implement, creating a permanent mark that would bind her spiritually to the realm and to the kitsune's influence. Throughout these trials, Ringo's jealousy and insecurity reached a breaking point. In a fit of rage and resentment, Ringo pushed Hinako down a staircase. The fall left her injured and traumatized, adding physical injury to the psychological damage she was already enduring. The betrayal by someone she had considered a friend deepened her isolation and her psychological fragmentation. She was forced to make agonizing choices about which friends to save and which to condemn, decisions that seemed to have spiritual weight and consequence. The realm she inhabited seemed to manifest her trauma in increasingly concrete ways, amplifying her inner pain into external monsters and impossible choices. It became clear that Hinako's psychic sensitivity had made her vulnerable to Silent Hill's influence, despite her being thousands of miles away geographically. The mechanism wasn't purely geographical. It seemed to operate across space when individuals with particular psychological vulnerabilities and particular types of psychic sensitivity were involved. Eventually, Hinako discovered red pills that disrupted the realm's hold on her consciousness. Whether these pills were physical objects or purely spiritual manifestations became unclear as the boundary between her internal and external reality became increasingly permeable. The consumption of these pills seemed to activate her own psychic defenses, disrupting the hold that the kitsune had been maintaining over her consciousness. She transformed into a bestial form, fighting back against the control that had been imposed upon her. She shattered altars and rejected the spiritual authority that had been imposed upon her through months of manipulation and ritual. In a final act of defiance, she broke free from the dreamlike realm, awakening to find herself screaming in the night, her body scarred and her psyche fractured, but her autonomy reclaimed. Her arm was gone, severed through forces that transcended normal physical explanation. Her back bore the mark of the branding ritual. Her mind carried the trauma of months of manipulation and abuse, but she had survived. And more importantly, she had refused the kitsune's vision of spiritual transcendence, choosing instead to reclaim her own consciousness and her own will. The significance of Hinako's experience was that it demonstrated Silent Hill's reach extended far beyond its physical borders. The town, or the spiritual corruption it represented, could apparently influence those sensitive enough to perceive it, regardless of distance. It was as if the supernatural phenomena were not bound by geography, but by human consciousness itself. Those with particular susceptibilities, particular guilts, particular psychic sensitivities could be drawn into Silent Hill's influence even from across the world. As the 20th century progressed into the 1960s and 1970s, Silent Hill itself was developing institutions and infrastructure that, while appearing normal on the surface, were deeply involved in the town's supernatural mechanisms. By this time, the Order's presence within the town had become deeply entrenched. They had agents in positions of power throughout the town's government, law enforcement, and institutions. The Wish House Orphanage continued its operations, ostensibly as a charitable institution, but in reality as a facility for identifying and indoctrinating children with psychic potential. Cedar Grove Sanitarium continued to operate as well, functioning as an experimental site where vulnerable individuals were subjected to psychological manipulation and experimental drug treatments designed to amplify their susceptibility to supernatural manifestation. At Alchemilla Hospital, the order maintained influence through sympathetic doctors and administrators who facilitated the identification and recruitment of individuals who might prove useful to their long-term plans. Throughout this period, the order was systematically consolidating control over the town's social and institutional structures. They were creating a system where any individual who entered Silent Hill and displayed susceptibility to supernatural phenomena would be identified and incorporated into the order's network. The goal was the creation of a town where the boundary between normal reality and the order's spiritual vision had become so blurred that the town itself had become a kind of supernatural entity, a collective consciousness that served the order's purposes. Then in 1974, an event occurred that would become pivotal to everything that followed. A trucker named Travis Grady was driving through the fog-shrouded outskirts near Silent Hill when he encountered a cloaked figure in the road. Swerving to avoid a collision, Travis's vehicle went off the road, crashing through a fence and coming to rest at an angle. When he regained consciousness and began exploring the area, he found himself drawn toward a burning house. Inside the structure, which was already consumed by flames and rapidly becoming uninhabitable, he discovered a young girl lying atop a strange seal marked into the floor. The girl was severely burned, her body twisted in agony, her skin charred black by the intense heat. But she was still alive, still breathing, still conscious enough to feel the pain of her injuries. Travis, acting on pure instinct and compassion, risked his own life by running into the burning structure. He rescued the girl from the flames, carrying her out of the inferno just as the building began to collapse. The girl would later be identified as Alessa Gillespie. She was extremely burned. Her survival seemed medically improbable, but she clung to life with a determination that seemed to transcend normal human resilience. The burn that had been inflicted upon her left her severely scarred and chronically in pain, but it did not kill her. What Travis didn't know was that Alessa was not an ordinary child. She was extremely psychically gifted, sensitive to the supernatural forces that permeated Silent Hill. Moreover, she was the product of the Order's careful planning spanning generations. Her mother, Dahlia Gillespie, was a high-ranking member of the cult, and Alessa had been identified as a potentially perfect vessel for the God Seed. The ritual burning had been designed deliberately to traumatize her deeply and bind her psychologically to the Order's spiritual framework. The fire was meant to scorch away any resistance, to create within her a psychological state so damaged and fractured that the Order could reshape her consciousness according to their needs. Travis's intervention disrupted this plan. By rescuing Alessa, he prevented the Order from maintaining complete control over her in the immediate aftermath of the burning. What neither Travis nor anyone else understood at the time was that Alessa's rescue had set into motion a complex chain of events that would eventually result in a fragmentation of her soul. The Order's plans for a clean, singular birth of their god were now compromised. The spiritual energy that had been carefully cultivated within Alessa would be split, divided between multiple manifestations and locations. Travis, now drawn into Silent Hill's embrace, began to experience visions and manifestations tied to his own psychological traumas. His mother had attempted to murder him when he was a child, and this unresolved trauma, combined with his proximity to Alessa's immense psychic presence, manifested as encounters with his mother's vengeful spirit. He was drawn through a labyrinth of nightmares, through hospitals and sanitariums, through theaters and motels, through antique shops and churches, each location warped into an otherworldly nightmare realm that reflected his inner torment. Throughout his journey through Silent Hill's manifestations, Travis encountered various NPCs and environmental puzzles. He discovered mysterious artifacts, pyramid-shaped objects marked with ancient symbols. These were called the floros, and according to the order's texts, they possessed the power to counteract or harness particular types of spiritual energy. The floros seemed to be designed as a technology for controlling or neutralizing supernatural manifestations, spiritual devices that could be activated to disrupt particular types of psychic phenomena. Through a series of increasingly disturbing encounters, Travis managed to assemble the complete set of artifacts. When he finally confronted Alessa directly, or rather confronted the manifestation of the god seed that was attempting to birth itself through her, he used the floros to disrupt the process. The activation of the floros resulted in a violent explosion of psychic energy. Alessa's soul, which had been carefully unified within her body for the purposes of the birth ritual, was suddenly fractured. Part of her essence remained within her broken body, but another significant portion of her soul was expelled from her physical form, fragmenting into a newborn infant that somehow appeared on the road outside of town. This newborn was discovered by a couple named Harry and Jody Mason. They had no knowledge of the child's origins, no understanding that they were adopting a fragment of a tortured girl's soul. They named the child Cheryl and raised her as their own, keeping no record of where she came from. To all appearances, they were simply a loving couple who had adopted an abandoned infant and given her a normal life. But beneath the surface, the child they had adopted carried within her psychic patterns and spiritual connections that would continue to unfold across the years. 7 years would pass. Alessa, trapped in her fragmented state, would remain partially imprisoned within the Order's influence, her psyche shattered and her power immense but unfocused. Part of her consciousness was trapped in a catatonic state in the Order's facilities, imprisoned and tortured. Another part of her consciousness lived as the seemingly normal child Cheryl Mason, growing up in the outside world with no knowledge of her origins or her connection to Silent Hill. The Order, frustrated by the failure of their original plan, would begin making new calculations, developing new approaches to achieving their goal of birthing their god into the world. When Harry Mason made the journey back to Silent Hill with his adopted daughter Cheryl, it was not of his own volition. He swerved to avoid a figure in the road, the girl in the blue uniform, Alessa calling to her other self. The crash that resulted sent Harry into the fog-shrouded nightmare that was Silent Hill, beginning a quest to find his daughter and unravel the mysteries of the town. Throughout his journey, Harry experienced manifestations tied to his own psychological burdens, encounters with his past, visions of his own failures and regrets. But he also found himself pulled deeper into the Order's machinations, serving as an unwitting tool for them to reunite Alessa's fractured soul. Harry's journey through Silent Hill was not a simple descent into a supernatural underworld. Rather, it was a progression through layers of psychological and spiritual reality. As he moved through the town, the environment itself seemed to respond to his presence, transforming and warping according to principles that had nothing to do with normal physical geography. Streets led to impossible locations. Buildings contained chambers that shouldn't exist within their physical dimensions. The very laws of physics seemed to bend around the manifestations that pursued him. He discovered that Alessa's psychic presence was actively probing his mind, searching for Cheryl through him. He encountered other individuals who had been drawn into Silent Hill's influence. A police officer named Sybil Bennett, a nurse named Lisa Garland, a doctor named Michael Kaufman who seemed deeply involved in the Order's operations. Each of these individuals was trapped within their own manifestations, their own personal hells created by the town's supernatural mechanisms. Harry fought through twisted versions of the hospital where he worked, through nightclubs and amusement parks, through churches and antique shops. Each location was a layer in a complex puzzle that he had to navigate without understanding the rules. The pyramid-shaped artifacts, the floros, continued to play a role, objects of power that seemed to have properties beyond normal comprehension. When Harry finally confronted Alessa directly, he found her in a state of profound psychological and spiritual anguish. The Order had attempted to force a reunion of her fractured soul, attempting to complete the birth ritual that Travis had disrupted. In the climactic confrontation, the full weight of Alessa's trauma and power was unleashed. She manifested as an immense and horrible creature, a physical embodiment of the concentrated agony and supernatural force that had been accumulated within her. But Harry, with the aid of the Floros and with some assistance from those around him, managed to prevent the complete reunification of Alessa's soul. The God Seed, the entity that the Order had been cultivating, was expelled but not destroyed. It remained dormant, waiting for another opportunity to manifest. In the aftermath, Alessa's psyche splintered further. One fragment remained in her broken body in the Order's possession. But the other fragment, the part of her soul that had been living as Cheryl in the outside world, remained separate. This separation was the crucial thing. It prevented the full manifestation of the God entity that the Order sought to birth. 7 years passed. Cheryl Mason, as she was known, grew up in relative normalcy. She attended school, made friends, experienced the ordinary dramas of adolescence. Her adoptive father, Harry, maintained records of her origins in a carefully hidden notebook, though he kept this information from her, perhaps to protect her from the burden of knowing. But psychic impressions cannot be completely suppressed. Cheryl sometimes had dreams and visions, glimpses of a reality that seemed to exist just beyond normal perception. There were moments when she felt as if there was something fractured within her own consciousness, some part of herself that existed in a space she couldn't quite access. Then, when Cheryl was 17 years old, she had a vivid dream in a shopping mall. She was unconscious for only a brief moment, but when she woke, something had changed fundamentally. Detective Douglas Cartland approached her, asking about her origins. This interaction was not coincidental. It was orchestrated by Claudia Wolfe, a high-ranking member of the Order who had identified Cheryl as the key to finally completing their spiritual agenda. The Order's theological framework had evolved in the years since the failed ritual with Alessa. They had come to believe that the God Seed required a particular type of vessel. Not just any traumatized individual, but specifically an individual who carried within them a fragment of an already fractured soul. Cheryl was unique in this regard. The portion of Alessa's soul that lived within her was inherently unstable, inherently partial. This made her the perfect host for the final manifestation of their God. More than that, the separation itself had created a kind of psychic wound, a gap in the fabric of a single consciousness that the God Seed could potentially fill. Claudia Wolfe was fanatical in her devotion to the Order's vision. She believed that the birth of this God entity would usher in a new age of transcendence, that humanity would finally be freed from the limitations of physical existence and from the burden of individual consciousness. She was willing to do whatever was necessary to ensure that Cheryl's psychological state was sufficiently traumatized and twisted to allow for this manifestation. She saw Cheryl not as a person, but as a tool, a means to an end that transcended any individual human life. Claudia arranged for Harry Mason to be murdered. The missionary monster, a twisted manifestation of the Order's power, was sent to his apartment to kill him. Harry died in his chair, a victim of supernatural forces he had fought against his entire adult life. For Cheryl, the shock and grief of losing her adoptive father was devastating. The loss and anger and desperate need for understanding opened psychological pathways that the Order had been waiting for. Cheryl was drawn back to Silent Hill. This time, however, she was not a passive victim. She had some understanding of what she was, some grasp of her own power. She was accompanied by Detective Cartland, a man caught between his duty to the law and his entanglement with the Order's operations. Together, they ventured deeper into Silent Hill's mysteries, driving through the perpetually fog-shrouded roads toward the town that seemed to call to Cheryl from deep within her consciousness. Cheryl discovered the truth about her origins through Harry's carefully hidden notebook. She learned that she was in essence a fragment of another person, Alessa Gillespie, and that this other person existed in a horrifically traumatized state somewhere within the Order's control. She learned about the God Seed, about the Order's centuries-long conspiracy to birth a divine entity into the world. She learned that her own life, her own existence, had been instrumentally manipulated by forces far larger than herself. The knowledge was devastating and clarifying at the same time. She learned that Harry had risked his life repeatedly to protect her, that his death was a direct consequence of his efforts to keep her safe from the Order's grasp. She learned that she was not a normal person with a normal past, but rather a being whose very consciousness was split, fragmented, distributed across multiple manifestations and states of being. The implications were staggering and horrifying. But here's where Cheryl's story diverged from what the Order had planned. Instead of fragmenting further under this knowledge, instead of succumbing to despair and psychological collapse, Cheryl found a source of strength within herself. Perhaps it was Harry's love and sacrifice that sustained her through the revelation. Perhaps it was some part of Alessa's fractured consciousness that helped her resist the Order's psychological influence. Perhaps it was simply her own will to live and to remain free. Whatever the source, Cheryl refused to be a simple vessel for the Order's divine ambitions. When Claudia attempted to force the final manifestation, Cheryl used a substance called aglopatus, a chemical derived from the Order's own pharmacological arsenal that had been discovered in Harry's research, to expel the God Seed from within her before Claudia could complete the birth. The substance acted as a spiritual solvent, disrupting the psychic connections that the Order had been cultivating. The God Seed was forced out of her body through violent vomiting, expelled before it could complete its gestation. In an act of desperate fanaticism, Claudia herself attempted to consume the expelled fetal form, seeking to become the vessel herself. She believed that she could succeed where the Order's original plans had failed, that her faith and devotion were pure enough to contain and nurture the God Seed. The result was catastrophic. Her body underwent a horrible transformation as the God Seed attempted to manifest within her. Her consciousness fragmented under the weight of the entity's spiritual presence. She was pulled into an abyss beneath the church, her ambitions finally and absolutely thwarted. The God Seed, still not destroyed but forced back into dormancy, retreated from the world. The ritual was incomplete, the manifestation prevented, the Order's grand design postponed once again. Cheryl survived the ordeal, damaged but not broken. She chose to honor her adoptive father's memory by visiting his grave after escaping from the town. She brought flowers to a simple grave marker in a cemetery far removed from Silent Hill's fog-shrouded influence. The visit to Harry's grave was significant in ways that transcended simple memorial. By placing flowers at his grave, Cheryl was acknowledging his sacrifice and his love. She was choosing to remember him as a person, rather than as a tool or instrument of supernatural forces. She was reclaiming her own narrative, choosing to remember her life with him on her own terms, rather than allowing the Order or Silent Hill to define the meaning of their relationship. Later, Detective Cartland and Cheryl departed from Silent Hill together. The detective's broken leg was a testament to his earlier stand against Claudia, but he walked beside Cheryl with a sense of quiet determination. As they prepared to leave, Cheryl revealed something significant to Cartland. She requested that he call her Cheryl, the name Harry had given her. This was more than a simple preference, it was a reclamation of her identity. She was choosing to be known by the name given to her by the man who had loved her and raised her, rather than by any name connected to her origins as a fragment of Alessa's consciousness. But the cycle was not ended. It was merely suspended. The Order remained. Silent Hill remained. The God Seed remained dormant but not destroyed. The stage was set for future confrontations, future iterations of the same essential conflict between those seeking to harness the town's supernatural forces and those fighting for their own autonomy and survival. Elsewhere, in a town called Ashfield, A few hours' drive from Silent Hill's borders, a man named Henry Townsend awoke to find himself inexplicably trapped in his apartment. The door was chained from the inside with heavy links of cold iron. A warning was slipped underneath from someone named Walter, a name that meant nothing to Henry at that moment. Henry found himself unable to leave, as if imprisoned by forces beyond normal explanation. In the days and weeks that followed, Henry discovered that the apartment itself was connected to something vast and terrible. A hole had opened in his bathroom wall, a passage that shouldn't exist according to any logical understanding of architecture and space. Through this passage, Henry was drawn into a nightmare world, an abandoned subway system that seemed to extend infinitely, populated by creatures born from psychological trauma and spiritual corruption. The tunnels were dark and maze-like, seemingly without end, and populated by hostile entities that emerged from the darkness without warning. He encountered other individuals trapped in this otherworldly maze. Cynthia, a woman who couldn't believe what she was experiencing and kept insisting that it was all a nightmare. Richard, his neighbor who had been drawn into the same supernatural trap. Eileen, another person caught in this supernatural machinery. Each of these individuals was a victim of the same forces, trapped in the same nightmare realm, each carrying their own traumas and psychological burdens that manifested as the creatures hunting them. As Henry progressed through the nightmare realms, he discovered that he was caught in a ritualistic pattern. A serial killer named Walter Sullivan was using Henry and others as part of a grand ceremony involving multiple murders arranged according to a specific numerical pattern, 21 sacraments. A ritualistic sequence tied to ancient mystical principles. Each murder was a step in a complex spiritual formula designed to accomplish something vast and terrible. The murders were not random killings, but rather carefully orchestrated events tied to a larger ceremonial purpose. Walter Sullivan himself was a tragic figure, a victim of the very forces that had turned him into a perpetrator. He had been abandoned as an infant and left in Wish House Orphanage, the same facility where the Order had been conducting their indoctrination and experimentation. Walter had been raised in an environment of psychological manipulation and spiritual corruption. He had internalized the Order's theologies in a twisted and deeply personal way. In his fractured mind, his mother was not a human being, but rather a spiritual principle. The concept of Room 302, the place where he had been abandoned as an infant. Walter's series of ritualistic murders were meant to complete a mystical formula that would somehow bring his spiritual mother into being, would provide completion and meaning to his traumatized existence. He was both a victim of the Order's machinations and a perpetrator of horrific violence. He was trapped within his own psychological obsessions while simultaneously being an instrument of spiritual forces far larger than himself. The line between his agency and his victimization had become so blurred as to be meaningless. Henry Townsend found himself navigating through manifestations tied to Walter's trauma and to his own. He encountered spectral versions of Walter at different stages of his life, from childhood to adulthood. He witnessed through environmental clues and manifestations the corruption and abuse that Walter had endured in the orphanage. He found journalist Joseph Schreiber's notes detailing the killer's abandonment in Room 302 and his subsequent rituals to complete the 21 sacraments. In the Otherworld water prison, Henry encountered a guard named Andrew Dalvo in a locked cell, only to find him later drowned with carved numbers marking his body as one of the sacraments. The facility's beatings and deaths, a direct cause of Walter's fractured psyche that manifested as relentless ghosts haunting Henry's steps. The water prison was a manifestation of the Order's methods of control and torture, reproduced within the supernatural realm through Walter's twisted consciousness. This spectral pursuit mattered as it illustrated Silent Hill's extension into Ashfield, where guilt and ritual intertwined to create invincible apparitions requiring specific wards like holy candles to repel. The candles seemed to represent sanctity and blessing, spiritual countermeasures to the darkness that Walter's manifestations represented. Meeting neighbor Richard Braintree in the warped apartment complex, Henry learned of Schreiber's prior tenancy and mysterious disappearance. The building's distortions amplified as young Walter appeared in ghostly form. His innocence as a child, when he had not yet committed murders, was a stark contrast to the adult killer's menace. Richard's electrocution in room 207, with numbers etched on his forehead marking him as part of the ritualistic pattern, propelled Henry toward Eileen's apartment. In Eileen's apartment, the adult Walter offered a doll from her childhood, a symbolic representation of his fixation on maternal figures and his psychological imprinting on particular objects and spaces. The doll was both a threat and a key, a representation of the power that Walter wielded through his ritualistic connections. The consequence left Henry collapsing amid the violence. The other worlds bleed into his reality, a testament to Walter's divided existence, bridging cult indoctrination with personal vendettas that ensnared the innocent. The boundaries between the supernatural realm and normal reality had become so permeable that movement between them occurred almost without notice. As the holes sealed and new ones opened in his laundry room, Henry entered St. Jerome's Hospital's otherworld, witnessing Walter rummaging through corpses before finding Eileen's giant head, eerily gazing in a hallway with an expression beyond human comprehension. Her real form was injured yet alive from an attack marking her as the 20th victim in Walter's count. Teaming with Eileen, they descended a massive stairwell revisiting Walter's realms, haunted by ghostly victims like Cynthia, whose forms now attacked them with the fury of the wrongly slain. The umbilical cord from Walter's birth, a key relic preserved by Superintendent Frank Sunderland, became a crucial tool in the final confrontation. This descent stemmed from Walter's holy Assumption ceremony, allowing his suicide as the 11th sacrament while persisting through created worlds to finish the murders. His body strung in room 302's hidden storage as the ritual's anchor, using the cord on a giant humanoid monster in the final chamber. Henry pierced it with spears while protecting possessed Eileen from a spinning death machine. The defeat allowed him to vanquish Walter as he called for his mother. The room's collapse and child Walter's disappearance outside room 302 signaled the end of the cycle. Eileen's survival led to her hospital recovery, where Henry brought flowers mirroring Cheryl's gesture at Harry's grave. Their escape was a rare reprieve from Silent Hill's extended curses. In the aftermath, the apartment's normalcy returned, though the fog's subtle pull lingered as a quiet echo of unresolved rites. In the shadowed fringes of Silent Hill's influence, similar patterns played out across different contexts. A former soldier named Jason sought solitude in a mountain range to end his PTSD-plagued life. His nightmares replayed the attack that claimed his unit, that claimed his friends and companions. But a car crash diverted him into the town's fog-bound streets, where monsters embodying his fallen comrades emerged from the mist, aided by singer Dahlia, whose transformation into a commanding figure revealed her own ties to the land's curses. She had been touched by Silent Hill's forces and had developed her own relationship with the supernatural phenomena. Jason dragged her to safety after a cleaver-wielding entity stabbed her. Their refuge in a survivor-filled building provided a brief respite amid swarming horrors. This intrusion stemmed from Jason's misplaced survivor guilt, the psychological burden of having survived when others had not. The town's mechanism turned his regrets into tangible assaults from the manifestations of those he believed should have survived instead of him. At a church confrontation, Dahlia ripped out her own heart to ward off the creatures, a sacrifice of profound significance. Her act of self-destruction allowed Jason's escape while simultaneously serving as a form of atonement for whatever role she had played in drawing supernatural forces into proximity with him. Aaron's ghostly revelation absolved Jason of blame, suggesting that his survival was not a failure but rather a responsibility. The event mattered as it illustrated Silent Hill's extension beyond its borders, where personal traumas like Jason's manifested as undead pursuits, ensuring his decision to live echoed the land's quiet demand for atonement. A state trooper named Robert Tower arrived on his final day before retirement, tasked with orienting replacement Mayberry amid rumors of the town's supernatural veil. Their investigation at the Lakeview Hotel uncovered a grinning madman's trail of destruction, The maniac, having exploded a building before hitching to Silent Hill, had been marked with sigils by those seeking to control or contain him. Tower and Mayberry discovered officers slain in elaborate scenarios, while the hotel's apparitions of long-haired figures vanished like forgotten warnings. This escalation stemmed from the grinning man's hunt for unfinished business. His powers weakened by Tower's freeing of the marked victims, leading to a hostage standoff where Mayberry's peril ended with Tower's gunfire piercing the threat. The confrontation was crucial, as it exposed Tower's shift from skepticism to acceptance. The maniac's bleed-out transferred burns from captives' foreheads, while monsters swarmed, forcing a final stand. Tower's grin amid the chaos reflected the town's role in turning disbelief into visceral reality. His shots at the encroaching horrors were a consequence of embracing the unseen. As the entities fell, Silent Hill's veil lifted slightly, leaving Tower to ponder the cost of belief in its silent wake. An artist named Ike Isaacs, cast out by friends for his creative slump, wandered into Silent Hill after a stranger's warning of sacrificial horrors. He found inspiration in the monstrous forms that manifested around him, discovering that his artistic practice was somehow connected to the town's supernatural mechanisms. His paintings seemed to provide both protection and conduit, allowing him to remain relatively unharmed while visitors met grim ends. 6 months in, his disappearing artwork sold mysteriously, trapping him when attempts to leave failed. The town's hold was a direct result of his immersion in its curses, which turned canvases into portals. This entanglement deepened with cheerleader Cheryl's group arrival, a different Cheryl than the one we've been following, sharing only the name, but not the destiny. Their bus breakdown drew them into Ike's protection amid attacks that captured two, leading to desperate rescues where paintings became escape routes. The confrontation mattered, as it revealed the town's supernatural tie to Ike's art for safety. His alliance with the group lifted his immunity, forcing a run where the cheerleaders betrayed him by sealing him inside a canvas. As the survivors fled after his sacrifice, the consequence underscored Silent Hill's use of creativity as a snare. Ike's entrancement was a quiet echo of the town's demand for balance through betrayal. In another manifestation, a psychiatrist named Troy Abernathy, haunted by his wife Juliana's suicide, took on patient Lynn, a film crew member scarred by a traumatic visit to the town. Returning Lynn to the fog-bound streets as a form of exposure therapy, Troy encountered a bloodied nurse resembling Juliana. Her scalpel wound was a grim echo of her death. The vision pulled him into battles with dog-like creatures amid the mist. This resurgence stemmed from the town's ability to resurrect personal guilts. Troy's murder of a monstrous Brett was revealed as his own dark deed amplified Lynn's entrapment, leading to a bridge standoff with Chrisabella, a girl in white who unleashed punishing entities for failing to spread the footage's horrors. The confrontation exposed Troy's hidden violence. His offer to sacrifice himself allowed Lynn's escape, though Chrisabella's recording of his death propagated the curse further. As groups watched the altered tape, its symbols drew them into the fog. The consequence wove Troy's torment into a chain of invitations where guilt manifested as monstrous hordes and fires, ensuring the town's reach extended through captured moments. Chrisabella's manipulations deepened in the mall's warped spaces where Lauren and her allies confronted the film's prophecies. The painted riddles summoned demons that exposed secrets like Lauren's ties and responsibility for her sister's unrest. Hordes enveloped her, leading to separations with monstrous allies slain by rival Waitley. The Order's servant blamed Lauren for amplifying the darkness. This power struggle stemmed from Chrisabella's lures drawing victims into her domain, where Troy's attempted killings of foes illustrated her control over the tormented. His blood echoed the town's demand for unwilling participation. At Brookhaven Hospital, Waitley's confrontation with Lauren ended in her banishing monsters through inner power, limiting Chrysabella's influence and leaving her to treat the girl in twisted therapy. The resolution's significance lay in Lauren's claim over Silent Hill. Her decision to stay with allies as the fog lifted symbolized a fragile balance. Though the survivor's departure carried hidden scars, the consequence rippled into further entanglements where the town's curses turned alliances into battles, fostering environments of eternal struggle amid its shifting realms. A hitman named Jack Stanton and his boss's wife Jill fled to Silent Hill after their affair. A pit stop at Sharon's BBQ was interrupted by pursuers Dewey, Liam, and Jimmy, whose ambush ended in the attendant's shotgun blast, diverting the chase into the town's horrors. Jack's pursuit of Jill led to confrontations with dog-like monsters devouring Jimmy's corpse. His undead taunts guided him to Pete's Bolo Rama, where a giant entity embodying past victim Tim Delaney attacked. This manifestation stemmed from Jack's careless killings. The town resurrected his targets as vengeful forms, culminating in Sarah's accusation at Brookhaven Hospital amid bodies of his deeds. Sarah's revelation of her family's murder by Jack forced a choice. His suicide of atonement lifted the fog. Her disappearance acquired end to the cycle. Meanwhile, the town's influence extended beyond these tales. The entity's shadows echoed guilt over past sins, tying into the broader web of fragmented torment. A prisoner named Murphy Pendleton survived a bus crash en route to Wayside Penitentiary. The fog drew him into pursuits by the Void, a devouring black vortex, and the Boogeyman, manifestations tied to his guilt over killing Patrick Napia in Royal State Prison showers. Aided by postman Howard Blackwood and DJ Bobby Ricks, Murphy navigated the town's warp districts from Devil's Pit Caverns, where tour guide J.P. Sada's suicide echoed his own parental failures, to the monastery orphanage, where reciting a protective poem failed against the boogeyman's suffocation of a child resembling his murdered son Charlie. This haunting stemmed from corrupt officer George Sue's favor, where Murphy's attack on Napier masked deeper betrayals. The void entity observed from afar as a symbol of vegetative torment. Sparing Officer Anne Cunningham revealed as Frank Cage's daughter. In the final confrontation, the illusions dissolved. Sue's framing exposed as the true cause of Frank's wheelchair-bound state. As the fog lifted, Murphy's freedom marked a rare escape. The town's judgment manifested personal prisons that demanded acknowledgement before release, leaving echoes of unresolved debts in the mist. Alex Shepard returned to Shepherd's Glen after a hospital stint he believed stemmed from military injury, only to find the town abandoned and fog-shrouded. His search for missing brother Joshua uncovered the founding family's pacts with the Order, sacrifices every 50 years to appease the god and avert Silent Hill's curses. Meeting Judge Margaret Holloway and mechanic Curtis Akers, Alex pieced together clues like Joey Bartlett's watch and Scarlet Fitch's doll. Each triggered boss encounters and otherworld shifts where the family's failed offerings manifested as skeletal and scarlet horrors. This unraveling stemmed from Alex's accidental drowning of Joshua during a boat struggle over the family ring, breaking the pact and inviting the bogeyman as his punisher at Overlook Penitentiary. Rescuing Deputy Wheeler and his mother Lillian from torture devices revealed the cult's resurgence. Holloway's drill execution was a consequence of her sacrificial zeal. Cutting open the Amnion spider monster to retrieve Joshua's body forced acceptance of his name on the family tomb. The pact's choice of him as the intended victim twisted his parents' neglect into protective deception. As Alex and Lillian walked away, the fog's retreat hinted at partial redemption. Though the broken covenant ensured Silent Hill shadows lingered over Shepherd's Glen through fragmented experiences like the Book of Memories, an unnamed recipient postmarked from Silent Hill rewrote personal fates via dungeon crawls gathering memory residue. The artifact's power clashed with a guardian entity embodying desires, his destruction allowing benevolent or selfish alterations amid Howard Blackwood's deliveries. In the looping hallway of PT, an unnamed man navigated a house trapped at midnight. Radio broadcasts of paternal murders and a fetal creature's cries culminated in Lisa's spectral hauntings. The chosen wanderer's emergence into the fog was a prelude to canceled horrors. Shattered memories reimagined Harry's crash and Cheryl's search as her adult therapy delusion with Dr. Michael Kaufman. The icy otherworld chases and encounters with Sybil, Dahlia, and Lisa unraveled his death 18 years prior. The lighthouse revelation affirmed Cheryl's fabricated memories as coping for loss. These visions mattered as alternate lenses on Silent Hill's core, manifesting psychological torments through therapy sessions or loops. Their resolutions were a consequence of acceptance-dissolving illusions. As the fog enveloped these echoes, the town's essence persisted, ready to reflect new psyches in its eternal mirror. From the native curses etched into Silent Hill's ancient soil to the fragmented visions of modern wanderers, the town's fog has woven a tapestry of unending torment, where personal guilts and forgotten rituals converge in cycles of manifestation and release. Early settlers like Jebediah Foster ignited vengeful spirits through violence. Their deeds echoed in tragedies such as the Little Baroness sinking where Hannah's drowned form lingered in Toluca Lake's depths, awaiting explorers like Eric to grant her peace. This pattern persisted through the Order's foundations, their orphanages and sanitariums, breeding vessels for a dormant god. As seen in Alessa's split soul drawing Harry and Cheryl into foggy confrontations that thwarted divine births, yet left seeds of unrest in the Japanese village's isolation. Hinako's rebirth rituals under the Kitsune's gaze mirrored these struggles. Her defiance shattered illusions born from familial strife, a quiet rebellion against forces that turned inner pains into beasts. As timelines branched into scattered nightmares, Jason's survivor guilt, Tower's grinning hunts, Ike's painted traps, the land's curses adapted, ensuring no escape from the reflections that demanded atonement. These echoes from Murphy's spared mercy to Alex's pack-breaking accident underscored Silent Hill's role as an eternal mirror, where resolutions like Cheryl's grave visit offered fleeting calm amid the mist's persistent pull. The modern fragments, like the Book of Memories, residue-altered fates, and PT's looping hallway murders culminating in a chosen wanderer stepping into the fog remind us of Silent Hill's adaptability, where psychological depths manifest as inescapable realms. Their resolutions hinged on acceptance that dissolves illusions and shattered memories. Therapy-driven reimagining of Harry's crash unveiled Cheryl's delusions of a living father. The icy chases and lighthouse truths gently unraveled grief's hold, contrasting the raw confrontations of earlier eras. These alternate visions mattered as they expanded the town's law beyond physical bounds, illustrating how curses extended into minds and memories. From Henry's apartment intrusions tied to Walter's sacraments, to the Order's lingering schisms and Vincent and Claudia's debates. In Hinako's pill-fueled rejection of rebirth, or James's submerged reunion with Mary, the consequences rippled outward. Each act of defiance or surrender fed the fog's renewal. Though delisted teasers and canceled paths like PT seem to mark Silent Hill's fading whispers, the timeline's arcs from native warnings to fragmented rebirths form a cohesive chronicle of a place where the past refuses burial. Its fog forever shifts to reflect the wanderer's soul. The village's misty fields, Toluca Lake's depths, and Ashfield's sealed rooms all converged in this legacy where figures like Travis, Harry, and Heather disrupted divine pacts. Their escapes were temporary stays against the inevitable pull of unresolved guilts. This persistence stemmed from the land's foundational curses, amplified by the Order's rituals and personal torments that manifested as pyramid heads, voids, or blossoming horrors. Each was a cause leading to reckonings that offered no true end. In wrapping these threads, Silent Hill stands as an eternal nexus. Its stories are a calm reminder that while individuals like Cheryl found resolve in graveside honors, the mist's embrace awaits those burdened anew. The fog that perpetually surrounds Silent Hill is not merely a meteorological phenomenon or supernatural manifestation. It is a symbol of the boundary between the known and the unknown, between the conscious and the unconscious, between the external world and the internal landscape of the psyche. Those who enter the fog often find themselves unable to distinguish between internal and external, between self and other, between memory and present experience. The fog is both barrier and threshold, both prison and gateway. In many ways, stepping into Silent Hill's fog is an act of profound vulnerability. It is a surrender to the possibility that one's own consciousness might not be trustworthy, that one's own internal experience might be shaped by forces beyond one's control or understanding. It is a recognition that the boundary between sanity and madness, between reality and delusion, is far more permeable than most people allow themselves to believe. It is an acknowledgement that the civilized mind, with all its certainties and categories, is built on foundations far more fragile than we typically admit. And yet, for many individuals, that vulnerability and that forced honesty contain a strange kind of peace. Once the manifestations have been faced, once the guilt has been externalized and acknowledged, once the psychological demons have been confronted in their grotesque physical forms, there can emerge a kind of liberation. The secrets no longer need to be kept. The lies no longer need to be maintained. The impossible internal struggle between truth and denial no longer needs to be fought. In the face of manifestations too terrible to deny or rationalize away, the individual is forced into a kind of radical honesty with themselves. Some individuals who have journeyed through Silent Hill report that despite the terror and the trauma of the experience, they emerged from it with a sense of resolution or completion. Not happiness necessarily, not freedom from guilt or psychological damage, these things rarely simply disappear, but a kind of acceptance of what they had done, what they had experienced, what they carried within themselves, a reconciliation with their own darkness and complexity, an understanding that they could neither escape their past nor transcend it, but could only integrate it into their ongoing existence. Others emerged broken, their consciousnesses fragmented beyond recovery, their psyches permanently altered by the encounter with manifestations too terrible to process or integrate. Still others did not emerge at all, their physical bodies lost in the fog, their consciousnesses apparently remaining trapped in the otherworldly manifestations, conscious but unable to return to the world of the living and the sane. As you drift now towards sleep, as the weight of this extended narrative settles into your consciousness and into the deeper layers of your mind, consider the possibility that Silent Hill exists not merely as a fictional location, but as a representation of a fundamental aspect of human experience. Consider the fog that surrounds each individual consciousness, the way we are all, in a sense, isolated within our own internal fog, able to perceive others only dimly through the mist of our own psychological content. We all carry within us the potential for Silent Hill. We all have guilts that we hide from, traumas that we avoid, manifestations of our own darkness that we keep carefully locked away in the fog of unconsciousness. We all have the potential to either face these things directly or to spend our entire lives running from them. The choice always belongs to us. The question is whether we will have the courage to step into the fog, to face what dwells there, to acknowledge and integrate what we have been avoiding. In the quiet of the night, as consciousness begins to slip away, as the boundary between waking and sleeping becomes thin and permeable, you might find yourself understanding Silent Hill not as external threat, but as internal landscape. The fog that surrounds the town is not so different from the fog that surrounds consciousness as sleep approaches. The monsters that emerge from the darkness are perhaps not so different from the strange and disturbing imagery that emerges in dreams. And if, in your dreams, you find yourself walking through foggy streets, encountering manifestations of things you have avoided, facing the weight of secrets kept and traumas endured, remember that this too is a kind of journey. This too is a movement through the internal landscape towards some form of resolution or understanding. The dream logic that governs such experiences is not so different from the logic that governs Silent Hill itself, a logic where metaphor becomes real, where internal becomes external, where the psyche manifests its contents with literal force. The timeline of Silent Hill suggests that transcendence comes not through escape or denial, but through direct confrontation with one's own internal complexity. It suggests that the path toward peace runs through the fog, not around it. It suggests that the monsters we fear are often reflections of aspects of ourselves that we have not yet acknowledged or integrated. It suggests that only through facing the darkness can we achieve anything approaching light. And so, as the narrative nears its end and sleep begins to claim you, know that you are entering a different kind of fog. The fog of dreams and unconsciousness, where the boundaries between internal and external dissolve, where memory and present experience blur together, where the rules of normal consciousness no longer apply. This is a fog that is familiar and safe in its way, a fog that your consciousness enters every night, a fog that contains dreams and visions and the mysterious processes through which your mind processes experience and restores itself. Perhaps in that fog you might encounter your own manifestations, representations of the guilts and traumas that you carry, appearing in symbolic form as your dreaming mind processes them. And perhaps, in the safety of sleep, you might find a way to acknowledge and accept these manifestations, to integrate them into your understanding of yourself rather than keeping them locked away in the waking fog of denial. This is the final message of Silent Hill's extended timeline, that the path toward wholeness runs through darkness, that transcendence emerges from confrontation, that the fog itself, though terrifying, is also a kind of gateway, a threshold between the fractured self and some form of integration and peace. The fog is not ultimately an enemy. It is a mirror, a teacher, a pathway toward understanding. Rest now. Let the fog embrace you. Let sleep take you where it will. And know that whatever you encounter in the mist of your dreams, it is perhaps your own internal landscape calling you toward understanding and resolution. The mist is calling. But this time you are safe. You are protected by sleep and by the distance between dream and waking reality. You can explore the fog in safety, can encounter the manifestations without the immediate danger they would pose if you were truly present in that place. And perhaps, in the security of that protection, you might find that facing the darkness is not as terrible as avoiding it. Perhaps you might find that the monsters, when confronted directly, are less monstrous than they seemed. Perhaps you might find, in the deepest part of the fog, a strange kind of peace. A peace born not from ignorance, but from understanding. A peace born not from denial, but from acceptance. A peace that acknowledges the darkness and chooses to live anyway. So rest now. Let the weight of this narrative, let the mist of these stories carry you down into sleep. Let the tales of Travis and Harry and Hinako and Cheryl and all the others who have ventured into the fog accompany you into the deeper reaches of night. And know that somewhere, in the fog-shrouded valleys and mysterious streets, Silent Hill continues its eternal vigil, waiting for the next individual whose burden of guilt and trauma is heavy enough to make them perceive the threshold, to make them step across the boundary into the fog. But that is a story for another night. For now, let sleep take you. Let the fog embrace you. Let the weight of this extended chronicle settle into your consciousness like a familiar blanket, heavy and encompassing and somehow comforting in its depth and complexity. Drift peacefully now. Drift down into the mist and know that you are safe here in this liminal space between waking and sleeping, between consciousness and unconsciousness, between the known and the unknown. The fog is calling, but gently now. Not with the terrifying intensity of Silent Hill's supernatural manifestations, but with the quiet, familiar call of sleep and dreams and the restful darkness that awaits. Sleep now, and dream of fog and mist and the strange landscapes of the mind that become visible only when consciousness has let go its rigid hold on reality. Sleep now and know that you are exactly where you need to be.